British instructors began to train their Indian troops to use a new rifle, the Lee Enfield, with a cartridge that was greased with animal fat. A rumor spread that the grease was made from a mixture of beef and pork, one forbidden to Hindus, the other to Muslims. It triggered a revolt known to the British as the Indian Mutiny, and to the Indians as the First War of Independence.
The immediate reason for the revolt was the belief amongst many of the Indian soldiers that they were being polluted deliberately by the British with the cartridges which had either beef or pork fat. However, once it actually started, a whole range of grievances came to the fore, which were connected with the things that the British had been doing in the preceding 30 years.
The revolt began in the garrison town of Meerut in the far north, when 90 troopers refused to handle the new cartridges. The soldiers were publicly stripped of their uniforms and sentenced to 10 years hard labor. The next day was a Sunday, May the 10th, 1857. As the British settled down after the church service, their slumbers were disturbed by the sound of gunfire. Native troops had stormed the prison and released their 90 comrades. Then, joined by a mob from the bazaar, they charged into the British quarter. Barracks and bungalows were torched. Men, women, and children were slaughtered. The Great Mutiny had begun. At first it was confined to one area in the north. The isolated British garrisons throughout India held their breath to see if the mutiny would spread. So too did Nana Sahib. Despite the urgings of Azimullah Khan and others, he held back until he knew how the British would react. Just a few miles from his palace was the garrison town of Kanpur, a magnet for many of the young women who had left Britain in search of a husband. One of them had been lent a piano by Nana Sahib, who was friendly with several of the British families in the garrison. Sincerely or not, Nana Sahib assured them that he would protect British women and children with his personal army if local Indian troops joined the mutiny. Throughout May, the peace held, and the British did their best to continue as usual. It was the calm before the storm. On June 4, 1857, the Indian troops attacked their British officers and set fire to their quarters. The entire European community of 1,000 men, women, and children fled to a half-built barrack block on the edge of the city, hastily fortified against attack. 2 days later, Nana Sahib joined the rebels with his own army and took personal command of the siege. The makeshift fortress was raked by cannon and musket fire. Azimullah mockingly called it Fort Despair. On June 10th, news of the revolt reached Britain, and 30,000 troops were sent to deal with the crisis. But it would take several months for the slow-moving troop ships to reach India. Meanwhile, at Kanpur and nearby Lucknow, the beleaguered British garrisons held out week after week under constant bombardment.
Several hundred women were besieged within makeshift defenses. Gradually whittled away, several of them having babies as went along, disease coming in, of course, lack of food. It was a most horrific experience.
One of the women, 18-year-old Amelia Horn, described the horrors in detail.
Every shot that struck the barracks was followed by heart-rending shrieks of women and children who were either killed outright by the projectiles or crushed to death by falling beams, masonry and splinters. Sometimes a whole family would be found lying dead, side by side.
The only source of water was a well swept by sniper fire.
On one occasion, we were obliged to drink some water mixed with human blood from the wounds of a native nurse or ayah, who, while standing nearby, had both her legs carried away by the bursting of a shell.
On June 12th, the hospital block was set alight by shell fire, burning many of the wounded to death and destroying all the remaining medical supplies.
No relief whatever could now be offered to the sick and wounded. There was nothing now to soothe their dying moments. The heat affected their wounds, and the flies settled on them and drove them crazy. It was now that our skirts were in demand. We tore every vestige to supply bandages for the wounded.
On the 25th of June 1857, Nana Sahib offered a deal. If the British would move out, he guaranteed safe conduct for the survivors to leave Kanpur by boat down the river Ganges. They had no choice but to accept. The point of departure was a Hindu temple where the faithful took their ritual baths. A fleet of boats had been assembled with native crews to punt the survivors to safety. Thatched awnings protected them from the heat of the sun. But as the Europeans climbed aboard, the boatmen leapt ashore, scattering burning embers from their cooking stoves. Hundreds of native troops emerged from hiding and fired volley after volley into the burning boats. Mounted troopers rode into the water, slashing down with their sabers. Over 500 men, women, and children died in the massacre of Kanpur. Just 4 men escaped downriver to tell the tale. About 120 women and children who had survived the slaughter were rounded up on the riverbank. The captives were herded into a building where the Indian mistress of a British officer had once lived, known as a bibigar. But help was finally on the way. A scratch force of 1,000 Scottish Highlanders, a few English Fusiliers, and some loyal Sikhs had been sent from other parts of India. They marched down the Grand Trunk Road in the full heat of the Indian summer. Nana Sahib set out to confront them at the head of 5,000 rebels. The new rifles played a key role, picking the rebels off at long range. The result was a victory for the British. The survivors fled back to the city to warn their supporters.
The British are coming like mad beasts, caring for neither cannon nor musketry.
At the bibigar, the number of captives had risen to 180 women and children, crowded into the 3 rooms and courtyard of the house. They included the 2 young friends who, barely 5 weeks before, had been playing chamber music on Nana Sahib's piano. Many of the prisoners were wounded, dying of cholera and other infections, or broken by heat and despair. A few recorded their experiences on scraps of paper. or scratched them on the walls with charcoal and broken bits of pottery. They could hear the rumble of guns as the relief force neared the city. But the faces that appeared at the windows were not those of British soldiers. The mutineers fired 2 volleys into the crowded room. But sickened by the slaughter, they refused to fire again. 4 butchers were recruited from the town. It was a little before sunset when they entered the Bibigar. They emerged an hour later. At the sight of them, the remaining onlookers fled into the darkness.
However, once it actually started, a whole range of grievances came to the fore, which were connected with the things that the British had been doing in the preceding 30 years.
The revolt began in the garrison. A rumor spread that the grease was made from a mixture of beef and pork, one forbidden to Hindus, the other to Muslims. It triggered a revolt known to the British as the Indian Mutiny, and to the Indians as the First War. British instructors began to train their Indian troops to use a new rifle, the Lee Enfield, with a cartridge that was greased with animal fat, of independence.
The immediate reason for the revolt was the belief amongst many of the Indian soldiers that they were being polluted deliberately by the British with the cartridges which had either beef or pork fat.
Town of Meerut in the far north, when 90 troopers refused to handle the new cartridges. The soldiers were publicly stripped of their uniforms and sentenced to 10 years hard labor. The next